The absolute worst thing you could do when you're learning how to mix, by far, is listen to anybody who tells you, don't use this because blah, 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 blah. Doesn't matter. A lot of times, and this happened recently, someone said, you shouldn't use multiband compression or abuse multiband compression the way some really popular mixers do, like Jason Joshua, because it messes with the phase and it winds up making things sound softer instead of stronger or harder or more punchy. The only way someone learns how to use multiband compression is by using it and abusing it. Use it too much. Then, when you make something you don't like, you can trace why you don't like it and learn how to use it in a way that you do like. So you correct failed attempts by learning because you failed. You can't avoid that. If somebody tells you don't use certain things because they make the stuff worse, you have to just ignore everything they're saying. In my opinion, abusing tools shows you what the tools really do. The best way to hear compression is to overcompress. That will allow you to hear it. Then once you hear it, you could decide how much you want. The best way to understand why somebody uses a tool is to use it, probably mess it up, and then come back from that. So let's look at multiband compression. Why does Jason Joshua use a lot of multiband? He doesn't use it because it allows him to get more punch. He uses it because it allows him to control things in a way that he prefers. He gets more control the way he uses it than by using full band compression, which compresses the entire frequency spectrum equally. Instead of working in that way, he's using multiband on certain things to allow him to get a little bit louder, to creep up his overall volume so that when he's working with a limiter on his master bus and he's got compression on his master bus, he's got all these things happening on his master bus, including multiband, it allows him to have those tools do a little less because he's doing so much prior to getting into those tools that they don't have to work as hard, the tools on the end. You get what I'm saying? So his philosophy is the more he tightens everything up before it gets to the mix bus, the less the mix bus has to work, which makes it so you can be louder in the end. The mix bus is still working and doing a lot, but it allows you to maintain a signal that doesn't sound like it's pumping. It doesn't sound like it's being ducked because the mix bus is not doing all of the heavy lifting. So the reason he's using multiband across his bass bus, his drum bus, he's using multiband in a lot of different places, is usually because it allows him to get louder. And he likes getting louder. And he can put the transients back using his other methods that he uses. Because the way he thinks about transients is interesting, and I like the idea a lot. Can a transient exist very low in the frequency spectrum? Yes, it can. But when you picture your ear experiencing life from listening to a mix, it's most often not coming from 15, 20 hertz. Most of the time, it's not down there. It's coming from above that. And as a result, if you want to put transients back into your music, you could just have a bus like he'll do and boost the frequencies from like 1K and up, and most things regain some life when you do that. So he's basically putting back transformer information by boosting areas of the frequency spectrum after he's severely tamed the harshness, because that's his thing. He's got a lot of methodologies that all make sense, in my opinion. All right. And everybody works different as a mixer. So what you should be thinking is what way makes the most sense for you. And that's why learning what everybody does is so important. You learn the different things from everybody. You may not use every way that somebody works. You don't use all the things they're doing because they might not all make sense to you. What I find works for me is picking and choosing the things I like from different people and using it in your own way. And you only get that by literally coming up with ideas from seeing what other people do. So you may have an idea that makes so much sense to you because you saw what someone else is doing. It sparks a whole nother train of thought of what a way you might want to work. So that's my favorite part about learning what the greats do, because when you think about it, that's what Jason Joshua did. Anybody who says they don't like Jason Joshua's mixes or his style of mixing, it's like that didn't just come from him. It came from everybody he learned from, including Dave Pensado, who's another amazing mixer. And not just him. It came from all the people that he basically looked up to, that had ideas that he also winds up using in his stuff. And when you think about it, that could trace way back. That could, depending on what you listen to. Like, I listen to a lot of old school Zeppelin. I'm taking ideas from Glyn Johns all the way up to people who are more recent, like Serban and Jason Joshua. Like, I mean, I'm taking ideas from everybody I can get ideas from. And that's what we all do in this business. And the reason someone's mixes sound different than someone else is all about up here. It's how you hear. The way you hear allows you to make decisions that make sense to you. So by learning all the information doesn't mean you're going to sound like any of these people. It just means you now have the ability to have more of a creative idea bin to pick from when you want to come up with a way to fix a problem you're hearing or make something sound in a different way that you hear in your head. Your idea, box is filled because you've learned what all these other people are doing. That's why what we do is so interesting, because it's so creative on one hand, but it's also so rooted in a history of what people have done to achieve different things. And as technology improves and changes, it allows us to do sometimes less. Sometimes we need to do more to achieve the same thing. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. The analog world, when everyone was solely analog, it bends and kind of flexes in a way digital just doesn't. And I mean, that's just, no matter how you look at it, that was the biggest thing I learned when I went all in the box, was I can't do what I used to do on analog. I'll give you a good example. What I used to do, and I still kind of find this interesting, funny in a way. I had the Fusion. I used to run this chain kind of a lot. I'd run into everything from the computer, through a bunch of different converters into the 5060, and then the Neve 5060 fed into the Neve Master Bus processor, the Portico 2 Master Bus processor. Then it went into the Fusion, and then from the Fusion back into, I had a couple flavors of converter choices because they all sounded different. So the Dangerous AD Plus has its own sound. The Burl, the BAD4M had its own sound. The Latte had its own sound. The Apogee 16X, they all had their own sound. So I was using them as deciding what color I wanted for what song kind of thing. What I used to do on the Fusion, and this worked with some of those converters better than others, but I used to keep the Fusion last. And I experimented with this as a concept because, most people, there's an EQ on there, right? So it's just lows and highs. What I used to do was put the high pass filter on at its lowest, the lowest possible, frequency you could put on there, which was, I believe, 30 hertz. And then I would boost all of the lows as much as I could boost at 50 hertz. And then in my mix, I would put nothing. I would boost no lows on anything. I would literally, in a lot of cases, cut lows on kick, on bass. I mean, I would do what I needed to maintain transient, but all the lows were being brought up so much at the end after compression. And the only thing that was hitting it after the Fusion was the converter to kind of put everything into place. But there was no compression happening after the Fusion. And I literally cranked the lows all the way up as high as they would go. Now, the reason I did that was because I tried it how a lot of people would at first, a little bit judiciously. Let's just add a little bit. Let's add a little more after what would happen if I added all of it? So clank, just cranked it all the way up. And I realized I loved working in that way. I loved boosting practically no lows at all, because in my room, I found it rather difficult to hear bass. So my thought was, I'm going to put all the bass on the mix bus, all of it. And then everywhere else, I don't have to think about how much to add. I'm only going to cut. That was like basically the idea. Sometimes certain things I wouldn't cut on bass. I'd just leave it at 0. But a lot of times I would cut. And just in doing that, I actually wound up finding a way that worked for me in a very magical way. I can't explain. And like I said, it worked like that because, though, it's analog. Because it was analog, boosting all the lows on there sounds completely different than boosting all the lows on a Fusion or a Massive Passive or, a Neve 1073 or anything you wanna think about, like, putting on as a plugin on the mix bus. Trust me, I probably tried it. I used 1081s, I used the API 550A, I used 550B, I tried everything I could think of to just what can I get to get that back when I first started trying to mix in the box, and I realized, I was like, "I just can't work this way. It doesn't work the same." I couldn't make it work the same no matter what I did. But in the analog world, that worked so well. The converter handled just kinda slapping everything into place without it sounding too boomy or blown up, and it allowed me to just sorta get this giant bottom end. And working in that way, it shows you a couple things. One, I'm not recommending anybody do this who has just plugins because I'm not so sure you'll be able to figure out how to make that work. With plugins, I found it's a little bit on multiple plugins works the best. Once I started working in that way, which is very, Chad Blake-esque, things started to make a lot more sense to me in the box. I had to do a little bit on a lot of things. And when I worked like that in the analog world, it just made so much sense. Just like the way digital with a little on each worked, using a lot in the analog world made things sort of feel better. So that's the biggest difference. And that's a technology thing, but it's also learning from a history thing. When you hear guys use like the Pultec trick, some of them were boosting a ton on the Pultec, tons of low end. And that's kind of where I got it from. I was just like, why not? Let's see how it sounds. And doing that allowed me to make things work in a really interesting way. So you take your ideas where you can find them, and depending on how you're working, you may find a way works for you better than another because everybody who has different gear is almost forced to work differently. That's kind of the thing I love about plugins the most is that it's such a cheap investment to get into working in a different way. That's the best part. You can change your workflow for less money. Whereas in another, if you're going to use analog gear, you wind up using a certain workflow that you have to use because you invested in that kind of gear, whatever it is, and that gear probably works a certain way and isn't, as versatile as every plugin out there. So there's benefits and there's not benefits to this, right? On all sides, working with analog and working with digital. But that was my favorite part was like, I can change up workflow more easily for a lower investment. And I am not someone who likes to do the same thing over and over again. I love changing up what I'm doing. It's very much something that keeps me excited about how I work. I hate using the same thing all the time. And once I had that stuff set in a way that worked, I hated the fact that I couldn't touch it. It sounded so good. So I just wound up leaving the settings I had on the MBP and on the Fusion. And if you guys are kind of curious what that is, I might put that in another video. Just let me know you want to know what the settings were that I had going. And I'll let you know, because I find it, I have no problem giving settings away and stuff because everybody works totally different. Like the way you hear is going to determine whether you like that or not. And what else you have in your chain, what kind of, are you summing or not? Like all this stuff's going to matter. Like it's not the same, I find, as just, if I was working any other way, if I changed one piece, maybe that wouldn't have worked. If I changed the order by one piece, maybe that wouldn't have worked. It breaks down to everything, including how I was using the silk settings on the 5060, how I'm using the silk settings on the MBP. There's just so much that goes into it. What the MBP has a compressor and a limiter. So what that was set at, all this would have an effect on what the Fusion does to the sound after it. You get what I'm saying? So I had to settle in to what I liked. And once I did, and I found that, I didn't want to touch anything. And to me, that was very disheartening. Some people may think, oh, great, now you have less, you can think about other stuff. You don't have to think about it. Yeah, that's the benefit. Once you lock in something you like, you never have to change it. I like changing things. I don't know about you. I like new stuff because it forces my brain to work differently. And it just feels like mental exercise. And I like exercise. So anyway, I'm curious what you guys think. Throw something in the comments. It's good stuff. And, this is not really intended to be a debate between digital and analog and what's better because I've used both and I like both. And at the moment, I am just so happy to have gone the direction that I've gone. And every once in a while, things like this come up where I'm like, to be learning and not have the ability to use multiband or want to because I'm so set in the way my chain is in the analog world, like, that means I'm never really gonna learn how to use multiband properly or in a way that's abusive and wrong, or learn what I could learn from messing it up and failing by using it. Never listen to anybody who tells you phase problems, this and that, don't use this. Use it. Sometimes the phase problems will get you to something better. It's not a phase problem. It's a different sound because the phase is not accurate. It's just a different sound. Like Chad Blake said, doubles the power of your EQ. It changes what things can do. It gives you twice as many options. And that's how you should look at it. Don't be scared of all that stuff. Maybe you like to work the way Jason Joshua does. Maybe you hate it. It means nothing. If you can learn anything from the way he's working and apply it to how you do like to work, you're doing well. All right? Leave a comment, hit the like button. I appreciate it. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.